This video contains elements that are not suitable for children under the age of 14. Viewer discretion is advised.
It was 20 years ago back then. The small screen show Thomas and his friends. They've been going in and out of style, but they've guaranteed to raise a smile. So let me introduce to you the trains you knew for all these years. Thomas the Tank Engine and his friends. After Ghislaine had been purchased by Hit Entertainment, they went about to reformat the show, one of the major changes being a core cast which we now know to this day as the Steam Team. This would comprise the original 7 engines, Thomas, Edward, Henry, Gordon, James, Percy, and Toby, as well as Emily, who had been introduced the series prior. All episodes from Series 8 featured the Steam Team in leading roles, while other characters would be relegated to supporting roles. Some would eventually make their way into CGI, others having been seen on screen for over 10 years as of 2021. Hit Entertainment wanted Thomas and Friends to focus on the target audience, children from ages 2 to 5, so they introduced learning segments in between episodes to insert an educational standpoint for the show, as well as develop a 22-minute broadcast. The episodes were also extended from 4 minutes and 30 seconds to a full 7 minutes, and the original 35mm film was replaced with Sony camera equipment. Barlow said that the adjustments were made in order to bring the show back to the United States, even though merchandise and VHS DVD sales were doing fine over here, but that's neither here nor there. On top of those changes to the show's format, longtime composers Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell were replaced by Robert Harshorn to compose new themes, while Ed Welch was brought in as songwriter. Mike and Junior had come up with new music ideas for Series 8 before they discovered that they were not asked to return. My guess is that Hit Entertainment wanted to give their rebranding of Thomas its own identity, separate from the 7 series prior. But even if you take away the fact that he had big shoes to fill, Ed Welch's compositions for Series 8 to 11, as well as Conga Legends and The Great Discovery, simply couldn't compare to the songs Mike and Junior had composed. Sure, every once in a while he composed a good song, but even still, they weren't within the same ballpark. As for Robert Harshorn, I wouldn't say his themes were bad, but they weren't the greatest either. It wouldn't be until the show switched to CGI that people began to really appreciate his themes, just as long as they weren't overshadowed by the in-your-face narration. But in Series 17 to 19, Harshorn's music really began to shine through, and it probably helped that he had help from his son Peter. Steve Asquith took over as director full time, and let's just say that he was hit or miss. On the miss side of things, so many of his shots had extremely pointless, epic zoom-ins on the characters, as if he wanted to make things more dramatic than they really were. And don't get me started on how many of the crashes were slowed down. I mean, come on! This is Thomas and Friends, not a Michael Bay movie. It just looks fake and stupid, and would play the rest of the Marvel series before the switch over to CGI. In theory, extending the episodes to 7 minutes was a good idea, as it allows more time to flesh out the story better, and could make room for some railway series stories like Super Rescue to live up to their potential. In practice, however, the execution could come off as a bit half-baked. I mean, episodes like Thomas Gets It Right and Too Hot for Thomas just feel really slow, and would probably have worked a little better with the original 4-minute 30 runtime. But again, it would be until Series 17 that the extended runtime finally lived up to its potential, even though they had added an extra 2 minutes by then. Series 8 was the first to introduce no non-human characters, which is surprising given how many have been introduced every year since in every series before, most likely to focus on the Steam Team. Because of that, a number of characters were left to the sightings, although every now and again, you'd see the likes of Diesel, Salty, Arthur, and Murdoch having small roles alongside the 8 main engines. This was most likely so Hit could make the Thomas brand their own, and Series 8 was something of a test series to see how the changes could work. Some did, but others did not. Now let's talk about the Steam Team, shall we? Up to Series 16, Edward, Henry, and Toby would each get at least one leading role per series, and while it may be great in terms of quantity, quality left a lot to be desired. Edward got pretty lucky with Edward the Great, but Henry and Toby, Not so much. Henry and the Wishing Tree pretty much froze continuity out the window by saying Henry had never pulled coaches before or since, even though there was evidence proving otherwise, even in background shots in the same series. "You could do it, Toby" was more or less a sign of dark times ahead for the little wooden tram engine. Gordon and James usually managed to get good roles, and their personalities weren't butchered too badly. Not to mention we got gems like Gordon Takes Charge and James Goes Too Far. Percy, however, was a bit more hit and miss. For every Percy's new whistle, there's a Percy in the magic carpet, and this pattern would continue throughout the Barlow era. Then there's Thomas himself. For this series onward, he'd be practically shoehorned into nearly every episode with a few exceptions, sometimes even as a cameo. Remember this quote from Reverend Audrey?
"They're so obsessed with the popularity of Thomas that they have what I can only call crane-shunted Thomas to all sorts of unlikely places in order to get him into or force him into a particular story, whether the story was written with Thomas in mind or not."
Yep, pretty much. In nearly every episode of Series 8, Thomas appears in at least one scene and or has at least one line of dialogue. I know they want to establish Thomas as the main character of the show, but I think they went overboard with that. Not to mention, whenever he's the lead character of an episode, his attitude varies. Sometimes he's actually intelligent, and other times he's a bit of a brain-dead moron. Occasionally he can be a bit of both, which makes his personality utterly confusing at times. Lastly, there's a newbie of the STEAM team, Emily.
Oh, you're bringing up Emily now? Nice!
What? Matt, what are you doing here? This is about my thoughts on the show, and you know that.
I know, but can I at least say something about Emily in this new era first?
Out!
Hey, what are you...
Sorry about that, folks. Anyway, as I was saying, let's kick off with the obvious. According to Sam Barlow, Duck was originally intended to be part of the STEAM team. I mean, the first lyric to the engine roll call goes, "They're 2, they're 4, they're 6, they're 8. And Duck is engine number 8, right? To add a female presence to the show, Emily took his place instead, which resulted in her becoming the most controversial main character until 2018. Frankly, I've never believed the Emily replaced Duck rumor, because if that was the case, then she would have had the number 8 on her tender and would have likely gone on about doing things the Great Northern way. And on top of that, she wouldn't receive her number until 2020. Why she didn't receive a number back when she moved to Tidbit full-time in 2005, or, from her very first episode, I'll never understand. Also, if Emily did replace Duck, then explain why he made a few sporadic appearances during Series 12, made a cameo in the navigation music video, and has made several appearances since Series 17, even in the Big World Big Adventures era.
Oh, Doc! Victor and Kevin did a great job fixing up your funnel.
Those guys at the Steamworks can do anything.
I think I can rest my case. Oh, and a side note, it's one of the best moments from that era, possibly the entire franchise. I'm also glad the writers don't really care about the Emily versus Duck fandom rivalry either. Well, other than acknowledging it in one episode later in the CGI era, and that led to some seriously mixed results, but I digress. If Duck had actually been part of the STEAM team during Series 8 to 16, let's consider how Engines 1 through 7 were treated. Duck would have likely gotten a similar treatment by going on about the Great Western Railway to the nth degree every time he made an appearance, and fans would not be happy about that, and they pretty much weren't during Series 17 to 19, despite wanting him back. Probably no happier than having Emily take his place instead. It almost feels like a lose-lose scenario either way, just have to pick the lesser of two evils. And that lesser evil was Emily joining the STEAM team, and that had come with a price itself. In Series 7, Emily was portrayed as something of a stern yet caring big sister figure. For Series 8, however, she became something of a bossy brat, think Lucy Van Pelt from the Peanuts series, in most of her starring roles. Keyword people, most of her starring roles. Probably the most infamous examples were Thomas, Emily and the Snowplow, and Emily's Adventure, and they made a good number of fans hate Emily entirely. So many fans hate both those episodes, but me, strangely, I don't. I mean, I declared Rusty's to Rescue not only the worst episode of the classic era, but of the entire show, so unpopular opinions are nothing new to me. So why don't I hate these episodes and yet many fans do? Well, watching them with a fresh mindset, I can see where they're coming from. But had they aired during Series 7 or perhaps even the Brenner era, they may have fared better. Giving Emily some character flaws was not a bad idea in concept, but again, the execution comes off as a bit half-baked. I think they needed to find a middle ground of her personality. She could still be a kind-hearted, caring sisterly figure, but could still lose her temper if pushed to the point of yelling at whoever's giving her grief. And I think I'd rather have that over something like Emily's best friend. With Thomas, Emily, and the snowplow, I think what they could have gone for is Emily trying to give Thomas some unneeded pointers, and he gets frustrated with her to the point that he almost refuses to listen when she tells him that he needs a snowplow fitted. It's almost like someone taking constructive criticism the wrong way, and we all know how topical that is. In fairness, she didn't tell Thomas that it was Sir Topham Hatt's orders, and she too got scolded for not listening to his orders, and then both Emily and Thomas apologized for their behavior toward one another. I don't think the episode's really worth the fuss it caused in the fandom. If you look at No Stove for Thomas from Series 17, it was probably the execution of the story that was really the issue. It doesn't even come close to being the worst thing ever if you ask me. Same thing with Emily's adventure. What if she was going through some minor scrapes and mishaps on her journey, trying to brush them off at first, but as the journey progresses, she gets more and more frustrated to the point that when she comes across Elizabeth, Emily finally loses it. That'd be a great way to teach kids that we all have bad days, and to not get overwhelmed with the small things in life. But was every Emily-centric episode from Series 8 to 12 about her being somewhat of a prissy, bossy brat? No, of course not. If you dig a little deeper, there are episodes where she's portrayed as being somewhat sympathetic. Two standouts being Emily's New Route and Halloween. Aaron Cottrell of fanfiction.net explains it better than I possibly can in his overview of Series 8, but what can I add to either episode? Well, I can say that Emily's New Route, in a series that has Thomas, Emily, and the Snowplow and Emily's adventure, feels rather out of place during Series 8. It's practically a natural expansion of her personality established in her debut series, and may as well be her best episode in the model era. That being said, I think that opinion would have been much more universal had it aired during Series 7 or the Brenner era. But of course, what's happened has happened, and it would take a long time for fans to warm up to Emily again.
You're damn right about that!
Don't make me come over there! Whew. That was a lot to go through. Now what else can I bring up? Well, Series 8 was the last in Japan to be narrated by Leo Morimoto, as well as the original Japanese voice cast from Anoa'i Production, I hope I pronounced that correctly, such as Keiko Toda as Thomas himself, although she would later voice him for events in Thomas and the Rainbow, Thomas and the Storyteller, and Thomas in Trouble from Series 11. From Calling All Engines onward, the voice talent from the Japanese dub would be handled by 81 Produce in Shibuya, Tokyo. For example, Thomas was now voiced by Kabuko Haiga, and she still voices him in Japan to this day. This last bit I'd like to bring up doesn't have a huge impact on this series, or any series afterward, but I'll mention it anyway because I'm sure you'd destroy me if I didn't. Food being transported in open wagons instead of ventilation vans. This was done in order to visually reinforce the contents of the rolling stock so children would believe it, but that just comes off as incredibly unhygienic, and could potentially lead to severe cases of food poisoning. I mean, cocoa powder is simply dumped into an open wagon like that? Yeah. Overall, Series 8 was something of a test series for Hit Entertainment following the format changes. I feel it's about par with Series 6 and 7. They have their share of duds, but when they're good, they're pretty good. So is Series 8 really worth the controversy? I don't think so. Compared to the next 8 series we'll be covering this marathon, it's on par with the first 3 series, and I'm already dreading what I'm about to revisit. 2005 marked the 60th anniversary of Thomas and Friends. To celebrate the occasion, Hit Entertainment produced an hour-long special, The First of 13, Calling All Engines. In between the story about the rivalry between the steam engines and the diesels during the construction of the Soda Airport were some interactive segments and a few songs sprinkled in. Honestly, they didn't add anything to the overall story. If you cut them out, the special would probably run at about 30 minutes, thereby making it an extended episode. Calling All Engines marked the returns of characters like Rusty, Lady, Daisy, Derek, and Diesel 10 into the series, but with the exception of Rusty, none of them would appear in Series 9. Lady and Derek haven't appeared since. Diesel 10 wouldn't play a major role for a special for 6 years, though he was mentioned in the Series 10 song Strength, and Daisy had to wait another 10 years before she actually got another starring role. The biggest shakeup in Calling All Engines was the rebuilding of Tidmouth Sheds from 6 berths to 7, thereby making Emily a permanent resident. Did it make much of a difference in the show? Well, no, not really. but it did mark the implication for 13 years that she and Engines 1 through 6 were the only real permanent residents at Tidmouth, as if they, along with Toby, were the leaders of the railway and the only engines that actually mattered. Series 17 to 21 did attempt to rectify this, as did Series 22 to some extent, by putting more focus on the side characters, and yet the Steam Team name lingered and would continue to do so to this day. As I mentioned earlier, Rusty made a return to the show with the remainder of the Skarloey 6. Except for Sir Handel, who wouldn't turn up until the following series. In the original American dub for Series 9, after being referred to as gender-neutral for Series 4 through 7, Rusty was referred to as female for the episodes Toonville Toots and Duncan in the Old Mine, yet for later releases on DVD, and for Series 10 onwards, Rusty was reverted back to male per the Railway series.
Rusty's favorite journey was by the lake. She liked to toot her horn there. The sound echoed around the hills. Rusty's horn was special. Rusty was coming down the hill with freight cars full of coal. She stopped when she saw Duncan. "Oh, look what you've done, Duncan," she hooted. "Why did you break through the barrier?" "I wanted an adventure," Duncan wished quietly.
Rusty's favorite journey was by the lake. He liked to toot his horn there. The sound echoed around the hills. Rusty's horn was special. Rusty was coming down the hill with freight cars full of coal. He stopped when he saw Duncan. "Look what you've done, Duncan," he hooted. "Why did you break through the barrier?"
"I wanted an adventure," Duncan wished quietly.
Yeah, that was pretty weird, wasn't it, folks? But that being said, did Hit Entertainment make the unintended implication of Rusty being the show's first transgender character? Regardless, having old favorites like the Skarloey 6, or rather 5 at this point, return to the show would be a good thing. Unfortunately, though, their personalities ended up leaving a lot to be desired, especially Skarloey and Rheneas.
Zack, I hope it's not too much trouble, but can I take the reins here for a moment, please?
Sure, I was actually hoping you would.
Thank you. Okay, have the writers decided to just focus on the flashbacks of very old engines riding out Rheneas and the Dinosaur and Skarloey the Brave this season? Actually, I don't think they paid attention to them at all, because Skarloey and Rheneas were a lot more mature in those flashbacks than these 2 episodes. I know Skarloey and Rheneas may look quite young, even in the earlier seasons when they were actually portrayed properly, but they should be the wise mentor figures the young engines look up to, not childish brats. To make this worse, the former of the 2 was implied to have happened because of a quick line in Emily Saves the World from season 18.
Really? Well, once I had to deliver a great big dinosaur skeleton.
I know Rheneas and Skarloey are hard to distinguish as individuals because of their personalities being similar in the present day, but them being written the way they were in those 2 episodes is not the way to do it. This is why I don't mind Rheneas' personality in Blue Mountain Mystery. He's not written too badly here, and he and Skarloey are easily able to be told apart from something other than the way they look.
As much as I agree with Rachel about how badly written Skarloey and Rheneas were, I have one little complaint to address. You wouldn't let me talk about Emily's persona in the last series, and yet you let Rachel talk about Skarloey and Rheneas for this series? What the actual hell?
Oh, back off, Matt. Unless you want to end up like Bishop Brennan.
He did kick me up the ass!
Anyway, in order to interact with the narrow gauge engines, a large-scale model for Thomas, known as Gauge 3, was built. A similar-sized model was built for the Pack spinoff, Gauge 3.5, and had been built during the production of Series 5, mainly used for close-up shots like the music videos for Night Train and 5 New Engines in the Shed. Percy was also made in Gauge 3.5 for the Pack series, as was James in Gauge 3 for Series 10, but we'll get to that next time. While I can understand wanting to save time for making someone like Gordon or Henry, Thomas felt blatantly shoehorned into the Skarloey stories, the worst offender being a random cameo in Skarloey the Brave. Like, what was the point of that? This ended up making Series 9 the first in which Thomas appeared in at least one shot in every episode. Alongside the reintroduction of the narrow gauge engines was the introduction of Mr. Percival, serving as an XP to the Thing controller from the Railway series. Why he wasn't introduced with them back in Series 4, I'll never understand. But with that said, it was one of the better changes that Hit Entertainment made for the show, establishing a different controller for a different railway system that wasn't the Northwestern. It does add a touch of realism to the series, instead of simply making Sir Topham Hatt some kind of almighty master of the Sodor universe. Series 9 was the first since the Hit Entertainment takeover to introduce new characters after not doing so for Series 8. How did I hold up after 15 years? Well, I'd like to start by saying Neville was very much a waste of money, despite the Q1 being a fascinating engine. He had only 3 lines in his debut story.
"Hello," puffed Neville cheerfully. "Hello," said Neville happily. "Thank you," whistled Neville.
And he was basically a plot device, and as showed when Neville appeared in 2 episodes after that, one each for series 11 and 12, and was never seen again. Even Hugo had more of a personality than that, and I'll get to him soon enough. Unless they decide to bring Neville back, I don't see him making a return to the show anytime soon. Next, there's Molly the Yellow Engine, and I just want to get this out of the way. No, Rebecca is not a clone of Molly. Just because she's a Yellow Tender Engine does not mean they're one and the same. That's like saying Bill and Ben are clones of Donald and Douglas just because they're twins, or saying that Theo is a clone of Fergus because they're both railway traction engines. If you want your character to be a clone, you have to copy at least a majority of the previously established character. Rebecca is a cheerful, somewhat naive ray of sunshine, while Molly is just there with not much in terms of personality. Of course, Molly is considered to be more popular than Rebecca, so there's that. And you know what? This is probably the point in which the show's problem with female characters started to make itself obvious. Barring Emily, who is one of the main characters, although not written very well depending on who you ask, most of the female characters just got shunted to the side after 1 episode, and if they're lucky, make background cameos afterward. Maybe a small speaking part if they're really lucky. Molly got 2 in series 11.
"I thought you were collecting trucks of presents," chuffed Molly.
"Be careful, Thomas," Molly tooted. "The wind is filling the boat's sails."
And after appearing in The Great Discovery, she was never seen again. Would I want her to return? Well, I had some attachment to her back in my teens, though since then, my interest in her has waned, mostly due to far more interesting newbies appearing in the series since. But I still believe that if done justice, Molly would have made a fine addition to the show. Thirdly, there's Mighty Mac, a double Faraday locomotive, and you know, there is a lot you could do with an engine like that. They could provide some muscle power for the Scarlet Railway, maybe help them out with goods work at the Blue Mountain Quarry. In their debut episode, we see them bickering over which way to go, and after getting stuck, realizing they have to work together as one engine to get by. So would I want them to return? Sure, as long as the Scarlet engines aren't constantly pushed to the side. The last of the newbies almost made it into the CGI series, believe it or not. Dennis probably had the strongest introduction out of the Series 9 newbies. He's lazy and manipulative, but in the end saw that it would get him nowhere if he kept acting this way. And in a show where we have an ungodly amount of Class 8 shunters, the Sovereign 11001 is a very unique design and almost seems to fit Audrey's mentality of including oddities on Sodor. So why not bring Dennis back? Well, interestingly, he was going to be brought back in Day of the Diesels alongside Splatter and Dodge, as was suggested by Ian McHugh, but Hit wanted new characters instead, as if Bell, Flynn, Den, and Dart weren't enough, so we got Paxton, Sidney, and Norman instead. Well, Paxton and Sidney did get starring roles in the Brenner era, and even a couple in Big World Big Adventures era. Norman was always in the background, and he's done nothing to draw me towards him. Funny how Dennis left more of an impact in 1 episode than Norman did in 10 seasons, isn't it? Also, this lyric comes off as incredibly ironic in hindsight.
Our new friends on the island here, once seen you won't forget.
Oh, older fans don't forget, but Thomas's owners somehow seem to. Some newbies from Series 9 through 11 were lucky to make it into CGI, while the rest sadly weren't, with Dennis coming painfully close. While Series 9 was being produced, Hit Entertainment put itself up for sale due to straining toy firms, and so they were bought up by the private equity investment group Apex Partners, which saved Hit from any potential downfall. Apex Partners would maintain ownership of the company until the airing of Series 16, to which they were bought up by Mattel, and the rest is pretty much history. Sharon Miller also made her writing debut in Series 9, and her writing overall for it was above average at best. Not outright awful, but at best, they were tolerable. That being said, she did set the bar for what we would later expect from her writing down the road up to Series 16. For this series, as well as 10 and 11, Sharon was the script editor before becoming head writer for Series 12 through 16. Sadly, her episodes and writing would ultimately earn her an extremely negative reputation among fans that has yet to fully heal, if at all. Is her writing for the later seasons deserving of the criticism it got? Well, we'll see when we get to each one. Even 8 years after her last written episode had aired, fans still insist on dogpiling all the blame on her and treating her like scum. Seriously, people.
It's time to stop! It's time to stop, okay?
Lest we forget, Sharon Miller is a human being like the rest of us. A show should not depend on one person in order for it to be amazing, nor should only one person get the entire blame for a movie, novel adaptation, or a few seasons of your favorite show being awful. Granted, there are some people who will do the research on what goes on behind the scenes, but then there's those who just won't bother doing any, and instead take their frustration out on one person online. And there are those who do their research, but still decide to blame one person online anyway, because why not? Can we stop doing that, folks? It's not going to make you any better than them. Two wrongs never make a right, you know. Now that I got that out of my system, what else can I talk about here? Well, Series 9 has a lot of firsts, yet another one under its belt is being the first to air on Milkshake from November 2006 to January 2007. Since then, the show has run every new season there since, being broadcast on weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9:15 a.m., though not without its own distribution problems throughout the Brenna era. Also, for the first time, the titles of the episodes were read out loud by the narrator. Not something that has a huge impact either way, but I wanted to mention it regardless. Something I didn't mention for Series 8, but I figured I'd do so here, is that every TV airing would feature Wilbert Audrey's letter to Christopher for the second Railway Series book, narrated by Nigel Plaskett, before the title sequence played, and following that was the Island of Sodor sequence before we got to the first episode of the day or week. The letter would be featured up to Series 12, while the opening Sodor sequence would be refilmed in high definition for Series 11, and then the close-up of Thomas refilmed for Series 12, and that also applies to the opening theme. The opening Sodor sequence was then redone by Nitrogen Studios for the CGI era up to Series 18 for the United States only. There was a recording of Ben Small saying, "Hello everybody, welcome to the Island of Sodor," but it was only ever featured in an interview with Veronica Chambers on the BBC in 2014. Starting with Series 9, the program would begin with Thomas's crew getting him ready for a busy day, and it was then followed up by Audrey's letter, the title sequence, and the Sodor opening sequence before finally getting to the first episode. After the engine roll call, the program would end with Thomas being cleaned by his crew after a busy day before the end credits played. While they didn't add much, it was nice to see some exclusive footage that didn't appear in any episode. Shame that they're hard to find these days, much less in widescreen. Another thing that I like to mention is the controversy surrounding Keeping Up with James, or rather, the UK DVD it was on, Little Engines, Big Days Out. In 2011, Hilary Fortnum, Wilbert Audrey's youngest daughter, criticized Hit Entertainment for the use of the term winter holidays instead of Christmas, and even said that her father would have hated the episode because of it, and not because of, I don't know, the awful writing style that was plaguing the show at the time. In an era where we had cargo being carried unrealistically, engines rhyming at the drop-ups of Topham's top hat, two engines with an unreasonably small load between them on a conflict, and not to mention the implications of firefighters acting like idiots. This episode specifically from 6 years prior was what got her all riled up. Unbelievable. That's all I can say to describe it. Unbelievable. Now granted, it did lead to Christmas being reinstated for Series 17 onward, but the DVD, which was a non-holiday release, let's not forget, had come out in 2006, 5 years ago. So why didn't Hillary call out Hit Entertainment back then? Maybe she just didn't know about it at the time? I don't know. This doesn't make any sense to me at all. I didn't see anything controversial about Keeping Up with James. On its own, it's a pretty harmless, inoffensive episode overall, which is more than what can be said about the likes of Thomas the New Engine or Skarloey the Brave. Overall, Series 9 was a step down from Series 8. Not a huge one, but still significant enough that it resulted in the show getting much more childish. Admittedly, I did enjoy it a lot when I was younger, but now I see that it's not aged very well. It's an average at best series, but unfortunately, it's about to get worse from there. Much worse. Before we discuss Series 10 proper, we're going to start this episode off several years earlier, in 1999. When Thomas and the Magic Railroad entered production, there were screen tests in Toronto, Canada, using the models in their Series 5 conditions being performed. The original glossy liveries would not have held up on the big screen, and so newer brass models of Thomas and Percy would be made for the film. Because they would be subject to intense use during filming, they needed to be in top condition since the original models have been given so many repairs over the years that the crew was concerned about these imperfections being visible on the big screen. As Series 6 was being filmed, the original brass chassis over the models were replaced with brand new CNC machined aluminum ones and would become the standard for new models all the way up to the end of the model era. Which brings me on to Series 10. By the time production had started, the original Perspex models were over 20 years old, having been in near constant use since the early 1980s. Because schedules were tight and there was little room for emergency repairs at this point, Thomas, Edward, Henry, Gordon, James, and Percy would each have 2 new brass models built, with Thomas himself having around 5 models by 2008. Toby would not receive a new model until the 12th series, and as Emily had been introduced in 2003, it is unlikely that she received a new model. The Thomas Tank Birch blog goes into fuller detail about the subtle differences between the original models and the newer ones. However, every once in a while, an older model would be utilized for filming for stunts in case the new brass models were damaged. For example, in the Green Controller, James's original Perspex model was repainted into the yellow and black B livery rather than using the new brass model. In Thomas and Scarlowe's Big Day Out, Scarlowe's small-scale model was used for the first time since Series 5, ignoring stock footage from Series 7, to be used for long shots alongside Thomas's Gauge 1 model, as the large-scale model would have looked too big alongside Thomas. This model has been preserved by the aforementioned Thomas Tank merch, alongside Sir Handel, Rusty, and Duke, as well as James and Edward's original Perspex models. Peter Sam's original model has since been bought by an unknown buyer, and who knows if Rheneas and Duncan will pop up in the future. Save for Series 10 and the pack, 2006 was a fairly quiet year for Thomas and Friends. All 28 episodes of Series 10 had aired in the United Kingdom across 2 weeks, between October 2nd and 15th. And that was pretty much it as far as new content was concerned. And no, the 28 episodes bit wasn't a typo. Series 10 was the first to deviate for the usual 26 episodes, presumably to celebrate the milestone of double digits. But frankly, looking back, they should have stuck with 26 episodes and removed 2 episodes. I would have gotten rid of Topped Off Thomas and Thomas's Frosty Friend, 2 of the most stupid, brainless episodes of the entire show, as they're literally 7 minutes of nothing of substance happening. There is a third I probably would have cut as well, but a character introduced in that episode appeared in later series, and we'll get to that soon enough. It didn't really help much that Thomas appeared in every episode with the exception of Duncan Drops a Clanger, making Series 10 the one where Thomas appears in the most episodes with the exception of Series 20. For the narrow gauge episodes, a wharf was introduced as another location for the Scarlowe engines to interact with the standard gauge engines, or at least Thomas and James, the latter of whom was given a gauge-free model so he could interact with Scarlowe and co. While Thomas's model looked fine, James's model just looked off, mostly the lamp irons and his confused face. Seriously, just freaks the fuck out of me. And his middle lamp iron looks like it's poking his chin. James's gauge-free model just looks ugly on the front. A large-scale model for Bulstrode was also considered for the set of the wharf, but because of budget constraints, the idea was dropped, forever leaving him a one-off character. Yet that didn't stop him from appearing in merchandise or books. However, we did get the return of Sir Handel, finally, to complete the Scarlowe 6. The reason we haven't seen him until then was because he was working at the Scarlowe Slate Quarry, which is weird since we've never seen him in scenes that take place there like Duncan. Not only that, Sir Handel was given a change in attitude, like doing his jobs without complaining, and even became wiser in most situations. Strangely, it was as if Sir Handel had become a gender-flipped Emily in reverse. Oh, and somehow he knows Fearless Freddy before Scarlowe and Rheneas did. Your guess is as good as mine. What the? I wasn't expecting anyone.
Oh, hello, Zack. Oh, you're doing SODORAMA, I see. How's it going?
Pretty good. I was just talking about Series 10, and I guess you want to say your 2 cents on Sir Handel?
Of course. I mean, if that's okay with you.
Sure, go for it.
Thanks! Okay, so, for those of you who aren't in the know, I've been perfecting my Scarlowe Railway story arcs for quite a few years now, and one major player in the arc is Sir Handel. I've been disappointed with certain aspects of the way he was presented in the books. He doesn't seem to learn his lessons very well. In Old Faithful, he learns to be kind to the old coaches, but in Mountain Engine, he's calling them cattle trucks again. And he doesn't even react to his mentor supposedly being scrapped in the story Duck and Jukes either. I mean, come come on! Was Audrey even trying to make him a part of that plot? I'm very surprised not many fans have attempted to correct this mistake. So, in season 10, when I saw him being a more kind and hardworking engine, this was a refreshing change. A bit abrupt? Well, kinda, but seeing him having positive interactions with the other engines, especially Peter Sam, left me with a warm feeling. I personally think if they mashed up the Railway Series Season 4 Sahandel with what we see of him in Season 10 onward, Sahandel would have been very close to being my favorite character on the show. And we actually do get hints of Sahandel's cheekier side in Season 20, I believe.
Are you sure you're saving time there, Samson?
Well, once I get going, you won't believe how fast I can be.
You're right! I won't!
Neither will I, Samson! Good luck!
Thanks for the insight, Rachel. Now, I guess Peter Sam would still be your favorite character regardless of making Sir Handel a more well-rounded character.
Very funny, Zach. I better go before I start rambling on about my headcanons about Freddy and Ivo Hugh. Catch you on the flip side.
Right, so anyway, let's get down onto the newbies for Series 10, shall we? Freddy is probably the least interesting out of him, and rewatching his debut episode, he practically rewrites a lot of the Scarloy Railway's history. But even if we take that out of the equation, his personality added nothing new to the railway. You've already got Scarloy and Renee's for being brave, wise engines, plus Duke if he appeared back then, Peter Sam being a cheeky scamp, and if you want a number 7 for the railway, Ivo Hugh from the Railway series, who was literally a blank slate. Back in 2011, or was it 2012? I don't remember. I remember there being a rumor that Freddy would reappear in the CGI series and that he'd be voiced by Bob Golding, and while Bob would later go on to voice the likes of Steven and Sydney, Freddy did not reappear in the show, with Series 12 being his last appearance to date, and hopefully it'll stay that way as, like Neville before him, Freddy didn't contribute anything to the series, so what's the point? The next newbie on the list, Jeremy the Jet Plane, did appear in the CGI series, or at least a merchandise promo of him. In a brief sequence in Letters to Santa, you can see his Trackmaster toy. While he didn't have much in terms of personality, I liked how, along with the Sodor Airport, they tried modernizing other aspects of Sodor like the Railway series did, so why not bring the airport back along with Jeremy? With that being said though, he could use a redesign. Those eyes on the windshield just look plain wrong, almost like something out of Cars or, more fittingly, Disney's Planes. Next up, there's Rosie, who back then was painted lavender. If you want to make Rosie a tomboy character, then why was she painted lavender, which is a stereotypical girly color? That is the complete antithesis of what a tomboy is supposed to be. In her debut story, Rosie just comes off as a creepy stalker, which was not the start they should have gone with her, especially since she was introduced with no explanation as to how or why she got there. In real life, the USA dock tank superseded the E2s at Southampton docks from the 1940s to 1960s, and that could have made for some interesting storytelling. What if Thomas had been resentful towards Rosie upon first meeting because her siblings replaced his own, even though she had nothing to do with it? That way, both sides could be sympathized with, but in the end, Thomas realizes that you shouldn't just judge someone for what they are and they become friends. That would have been a much better introduction to Rosie than just making her a stalker in their debut story, and then doing little to nothing with her after that, even though she would eventually get a revamp in 2017, but even then, they'd done little with her since, save for one episode in Series 22. It is a shame because there was so much you could have done with Rosie before and after her revamp. I've seen a fair amount of fan content that at least tried to make some use of her, and heck, I've even had a few ideas myself on what to do with Rosie for my own headcanon for this series. As much as I find Thomas in the Birthday Mail to be a bad episode, it is nothing compared to the debut episode of Rocky the Crane, the infamous Edward Strikes Out. Why is it infamous? Well...
That crane might be big, Gordon sniffed, but he has no engine. He can't move unless another engine pulls him. Then I don't think he can be really useful, chuffed Edward slowly. Quite right, Edward, huffed Gordon. He will only get in the way.
That right there, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason why Edward leaving the Steam Team in Series 21, even though it should have been abolished by then, was a good thing for him. Throughout series 8 to 16, Edward was constantly given starring roles even when they didn't fit him, but Edward Strikes Out is the worst offender of the lot. It is the complete antithesis to Edward as a character. This is the same engine who stood by Duck's side when Diesel spread lies about him out of petty revenge, served as a mentor figure to smaller engines like Thomas and Percy, saved Trevor from scrap, saved James from potentially crashing, helped Gordon up his own hill, and got passengers home despite being crippled. Edward may be engine number 2, but he is number 1 to the hearts of so many fans, and for good reason. There is nothing more sickening than just seeing him outright bully Rocky like he did, except maybe a later episode from Series 15 which we'll get to, even going so far as to call him newfangled nonsense to his face. Yes, Gordon may have been an influence on Edward, but it was Edward himself who also acted rude to Rocky of his own volition. There is no way you can redeem this episode after such a horrifying scene like that. Not only that, this episode is something that Rocky as a character will never live down, because this is his introductory episode, and almost makes it canon as much as I wish it weren't, especially since Edward's had far better roles before and since. Okay, granted, he did have a few slip-ups before this episode.
He doesn't even look like an engine, said Edward.
And afterward.
I'm not setting one wheel out there in the dark.
But there were minor moments that could have easily been fixed. Edward Strikes Out would need a complete rewrite from the ground up in order to make better sense, but as it stands, it'll forever be remembered as the episode that destroyed Edward's character before Andrew Brenner took the reins as head writer. It also likely cemented Sharon Miller's growing negative reputation among older fans, and remains one of the darkest marks she has yet to shake. What else can be said about Rocky? Well, for the CGI series up until Series 20, he virtually replaced the breakdown train, which is neither practical nor economical. Why would anyone think of replacing 2 cranes with just 1? My Little Pony's last season did something similar with Twilight Sparkle, a princess who's already got too much time on her hooves as it is, not to mention certain behavioral issues in the past, taking over for Celestia and Luna. It was a terrible, ill-suited idea if it didn't have any degree of sense or logic behind it. It was quite possibly the worst idea the show had ever come up with.
That was unexpected.
Okay, make that second worst idea, but I'm not through with that one yet. What's that got to do with Rocky? Long and short, replacing 2 of something with 1 of that same something does not work no matter which way you slice it. If it didn't work for My Little Pony or Thomas and Friends until Series 20, then what chance does it have working at all? I would talk about Rocky's personality next, but there's very little to it. He's had more screen time than Rosie, and yet he doesn't show much in terms of character, which is actually kind of pathetic, since Rosie's always had a chance to show what she could do, while half the time, Rocky just seems shoehorned when it could have also used Judy and Jerome. Well, that rant went on a bit longer than I thought, and now that I think about it, that was all really messed up what they did back then. Any other highlights I could mention? Well, we did have the Chinese dragon reappearing in Percy and the Fun Fair, Duck got a cameo in the navigation music video, and It's Good to Be Gordon was really great, but that's pretty much all I could think of. For the airings of Series 10 on television, a new segment called Sodor Special Places was featured, which would involve a location on Sodor such as Nappert Station, Gordon's Hill, Tidmouth Sheds, and Brendam Docks. This was followed up in Series 11 with Fun Times with Our Friends, and then in Series 12 with Thomas's Favorite Friends, each featuring recaps of episodes from Series 8 to 10, focusing on a specific character or group of characters in the question. On the whole, Season 10 was bad. It's the first series thus far that I've ranked 3 episodes as atrocious, and they really sank the whole ship. If you took out Topped Off Thomas and Thomas's frosty friend, then this series would just be mediocre at best. But as it is, it's aged like milk in the sun, and the models beginning to show their age didn't really help much. It's a real slog to sit through, save for a few gems. Mind you, for the next few years, at least in terms of episode quality, it was about to get much worse. Again. 2007 marked the release of the first Railway Series book since Will and Audrey's death a decade prior, Thomas and Victoria. As I explained during the overview for Series 5, the book was going to be published back in 1997, but it was shelved once Bert Allcroft bought the rights from William Heinemann. So who knows what Christopher Awdry could have come up with had Thomas and Victoria actually been published back then? Could Barry's book have finally been published and we would have actually gotten to see what his character was like?
The world may never know.
So what was Thomas and Victoria about? Well, once again returning to Thomas's branch line, as if we didn't have enough books featuring it already, the Farquhar team were joined by an old furnace railway coach called Victoria, who became a part of Toby's vintage train alongside Toby himself and Henrietta, the latter of whom was seen for the first time with a face. She wouldn't gain a face on TV for another 7 years, but we'll get to that later. Moving on to the TV series at hand, Series 11 was one for many firsts and lasts. In the case for the latter, it was the last series to exclusively use resin cast faces, as well as be a models-only series, while Series 12 would be the transitional series from models to CGI. A couple of scenes from Thomas and the Stinky Cheese were used as a test to see how the show could look in CGI, and oh my goodness, has it aged horribly. I know I should cut some slack. I mean, nobody's expecting it to be Pixar quality, but I think we should be glad that even now, the animation is nothing like that. Don't Be Silly Billy was also considered for animation tests, but they never came to pass. Probably a good thing too, and I'll get to why soon enough. Series 11 was intended to be the last series for long-standing narrators of the United Kingdom and the United States, Michael Angelis and Michael Brandon, respectively. They were going to be replaced in both dubs by Irish-American James Bond actor Pierce Brosnan up to at least Series 14, but for unknown reasons, he left after The Great Discovery, bringing back both Michaels for 5 more series. This would leave the aforementioned special Brosnan's sole narrative contribution to the show. We may never know why he left, but did Pierce ask for too much money? Or maybe he was too busy with other projects at the time. Who knows? As you would expect by this point, new characters were introduced to Series 11, with the only one making it to the CGI series being Whiff the Rubbish Engine. There's just something I don't get here. People criticize him because he wears glasses? We've had the ballast cleaner from the railway series wear glasses too on the wooden railway model, and nobody freaked out then. Can someone fill me in on why? I just don't get it. But I do like the look of Whiff, and that he doesn't seem to care what others think about his appearance. He even says so himself in his debut episode.
My name's Whiff, because I'm a bit smelly.
Oh yeah, and side note, Emily's Rubbish is one of the worst episode titles in the show. I much prefer to call it by the US title, Emily and the Garbage. It just sounds less offensive in my opinion. Anyway, considering Whiff was in the CGI series, there is a lot they could have done with him. Maybe have him take on other jobs away from garbage collecting? Given that his basis was a passenger engine back in her day, what about taking a passenger train for the first time by himself? He didn't appear very frequently in the Burner era, so what's the deal here? While Whiff did make it into the CGI series, someone else almost did, but thankfully that didn't happen, and considering the reboot, probably never will. That being Prototype Charlie, aka Billy.
Thomas, huffed Billy, stop telling me what to do. You are a very bossy engine.
Ugh, I hate this little brat so much. Every time he opens his stupid fat mouth, I just want to punch him in the nose. And he acted like an ungrateful bastard around Thomas when he tries to help him out. Combine that with the Free Strikes formula, it makes for a painful experience and the worst introductory episode since Edward Strikes Out, which was literally in the last series, and by the same writer no less. Even a child learning to share for the first time isn't as horrible as Billy was in his only episode. Apart from cloning Charlie's render to make him, what would Billy even add to the show?
Nothing! Absolutely nothing!
Exactly. I just see no potential in him whatsoever, and the only time I want to see him come back to the show is if he was being ripped apart by Diesel 10. Now, Billy almost did return for Series 13 in Splish Splash Splosh, but thankfully, they dodged a bullet and used Charlie instead. I'll be glad if Billy never returns to the show. Fuck this infuriating little brat!
You are a very...
Shut up!
Thank you.
You're not the only one to hate that buck-toothed brat, Zack. I hate him just as much as you do.
You are a very...
Even then, there are 3 characters whom I hate even more. But it's way too early for me to say who they are.
Yeah, I get it. Now do me a favor, Matt. Let me do the review in peace before I throw you out again. Now that that's out of the way, who's next?
Keep away! roared Hector.
Ah, yes. Hector the Hopper. After the worst Series 11 newbie, we get the best of the bunch. Hector had a really good character arc for the 2 episodes he appeared in. He started off very aggressive, but after Thomas gave him a good hard bump, Hector revealed that he acted this way because he was scared of being filled up with coal, but then saw it wasn't so scary after all. An episode from the Barla era that tackled the issue of bullying far better than Apology Impossible did 11 years later? How the hell is that possible? Anyway, in his next and final appearance, Hector gives James some advice when it comes to handling snowy weather, which further showcased his character growth. Would I have wanted him to return to the show? Absolutely! As one of the few trucks in the NWR that isn't troublesome, Hector could definitely add some variety to the yards, not just in size either. Plus, maybe he could have paved the way to give more trucks some individual personalities. Lastly, there's Madge the Snub-Nosed Lorry, the only Series 11 newbie to appear in more than one episode in said series, yet after appearing in The Great Discovery, she hasn't appeared since. We do, however, get glimpses of her wanting to play things safe in snowy conditions, and seeing her act motherly toward the little engines, even if Scarlet and Rheneas are technically older, but I digress. So why hasn't she been expanded upon since then? If you wanted more field representation in the show, they could have brought Madge back into the show and still have her work alongside the Scarlet engines. That seemed like a pretty good win-win scenario there if you ask me. And speaking of the Scarlet engines, a whole DVD was dedicated to them in October 2007, about a month after the rest of Series 11 had aired on television in the United Kingdom. Engines and Escapades featured 6 episodes that would not air on television until January 2008, a practice that would later be repeated for Series 17 to 20. At the time, releasing 6 episodes at once and marketing them as DVD exclusive was quite the novelty. I'm not counting Series 3 and 4, despite them being released on VHS first for the record. But sadly, the episodes were subpar for the most part, with the Madge episodes being the only good ones on the DVD, while the rest were just forgettable. The only other exclusive thing on the DVD was the only new song in Series 11, dedicated to the Scarlet 6 plus Mighty Mac and Freddy.
They are the narrow gauge engines, running on a narrow gauge track. Friends like Rusty, Duncan, Fearless, Freddy, Mighty Mac.
While Series 11 was broadcast on Milkshake, Dirty Work, not the one from Series 2 obviously, Hector the Horrid, Thomas and the Spaceship, Don't Be Silly Billy, and Hide and Peep all had some scenes that differed from the half-hour airings on PBS Kids for the United States and Nick Jr. for the United Kingdom. The scenes are generally on the same sets as the original, but each are at different angles. Save for Series 1, which had some notorious restoration mistakes, while Series 2 through 3 didn't have as many, I don't recall any other series having refilmed footage for certain episodes. Series 11 was the first to have Christopher Scala as executive producer, and would remain in this position until the first half of Series 15. Meanwhile, this was also the last series to have Sharon Miller as script editor before she became head writer for Series 12 through 16. And believe me when I say it gets worse from here. 9 through 11 had their share of bad episodes, Series 10 especially, but they paled compared to the awful episodes Series 12 through 16 brought out. Except maybe Edward Strikes Out, but we'll see when I get to them. The theme song was given a revamp so that the lyrics to the engine roll call would play to introduce the show, most likely to go along with the refilmed scenes for the intro, with the last shot of Thomas going under the bridge being refilmed to include CGI elements, and as explained, it was later reanimated entirely for CGI and would remain that way until Series 18. So how does Series 11 compare to the last 3 series? Well, it's better than Series 10, but not by much, but it's still worse than Series 8 and 9. Without Billy's debut episode, I think it would probably be on par with the latter two, while Series 10 would still be stone dead last for the model series. But how will Series 12 compare to all 4? That is something we shall find out next Monday. 2008 was a rather sad year for the Thomas fandom. Veteran director David Mitton died from a heart attack on May 16, 2008 at the age of 69. He was working on a new CGI animated series called Adventures on Orsum Island at the time of his death, but only a few episodes were partially completed before he died. At the time, Soda Island forums were conducting some interviews with him, but many questions for David were left unanswered, and we may never know the answers to some of them. As if that wasn't enough, on June 22nd, former American narrator George Carlin died of heart failure at the age of 71. I was a young teenager at the time of George's death, and learning that about someone whose narrations I loved growing up really gutted me. Even with Rusty's to the Rescue, no matter how bad I may find an episode, I could never really hate his narration.
Diesel, silent and still, lined up on guard. Who are you? Rusty plucked up courage. I'm a shed and sidings inspection Diesel. Have you any engines in the shed? No, none. Rusty rallied again. Then what about the sidings? One. We have one. Rusty grew braver still. Then I'll just go and inspect.
See, folks, I'm not negative all the time. Even when discussing things I dislike, I can usually say something positive now and then. Most of the time. Another tragedy would strike the fandom, but it was not someone from the production crew. Oh no. After Series 12 would finish production, the models would be retired altogether in favor of 3D computer-generated imagery, or CGI for short. To make the transition easier to stomach, the characters' faces were animated with the aid of motion captures, as the physical models' faces were replaced with white targets with white triangles to add in the computer-animated faces in post-production. In addition, human characters like Sir Topham Hatt were fully animated in CGI, as was Harold the Helicopter. However, in some shots, resin faces were used mainly in the background and for scenes where objects would have obscured the vehicle's faces. And boy, has the CGI aged so poorly. I'm all in favor of going for a mix of styles, just as long as they work well together. But the CGI model hybrid just doesn't look right, and it comes off as uncanny valley, like this shot for example.
Thomas the hero, beamed from buffer to buffer.
Seriously, just what the fuck is up with Thomas here? He looks like a goddamn child molester. But fortunately, we weren't stuck with that for too long. Hit Entertainment wanted to produce more model CGI hybrid series, but as I mentioned earlier, the models were retired due to low finances and budget cuts. And since the show transitioned to full CGI, that was probably for the best. I mean, just compare Series 13, which we'll get to next time, to Series 12, and you can tell that the faces are vastly improved. While the first 6 engines each received new models back in Series 10, Toby received a new chassis for this series, likely due to how worn out his original Markland chassis was, having been used since 1983 all the way up to 2007. Since Series 12 was the last to use models, what was the point of giving Toby a new chassis? He only appeared in 6 episodes, so it wasn't like it would make much of a difference, would it? Speaking of being the last series to use models, Series 12 marked the rather brief returns of the likes of Duck, Oliver, Toad, Bulgy, Jack, Alfie, and even Max or Monty, as well as a surprise cameo from Stepney. While most of them have returned in CGI at various times between 2013 and 2017, Stepney hasn't really been seen since Rosie's Funfair special, most likely because Andrew Viner was a fan of his book as a child. I get that they wanted to make this series a send-off for the models, but come on! You could literally replace them with various members of the STEAM team and nothing would change in terms of writing. Also, I know that we also got Donald, Douglas, Murdoch, Arthur, and Neville appearing in brief roles, but technically I don't count them as returnees since they appeared in Series 11. Why I didn't mention the Scott's role in Gordon and the Engineer last time, I don't know. On top of that, we even got Proteus returning in statue form. And as usual, some new characters were introduced for Series 12. Apart from Stanley...
Welcome, Stanley!
Apart from Stanley...
Welcome, Stanley!
Apart from Stanley...
Welcome, Stanley!
Apart from Stanley, who was introduced in The Great Discovery, and has since gone on to become a background engine throughout the CGI era since Series 14, with a few speaking lines if he's lucky, not to mention constantly changing voice actors in the American dub and the odd occasion in the British dub.
You weren't at Tidmouth Sheds. My firebox is faulty. I won't be able to go to the children's party.
Scrapped. Here you go, James. Fresh from the washdown.
Please, sir, I beg you, I just have to know. Will you, won't you take me to the railway show?
At least you're back on the rails again, James. And just in time, too. Henry's being delayed. Sir Topham Hatt wants you to take his heavy goods train.
Seriously, what was up with that? Anyway, Series 12 introduced 3 new characters who each only appeared once and were never seen again. Hank the American Engine was fine, but not what I would call a fan favorite. If he was to appear again, it would probably be in the United States where he was built, but considering the upcoming revamp, I doubt that'll happen anytime soon. Also, I don't know if anyone knows about this, but Andrew Brenner planned to have him return in Series 22 along with Boko, but Mattel had other ideas. Florida Steam Tram, meanwhile, basically took away what made Toby unique by being the only steam tram on Sodor, but ignoring that, her personality was just a borderline Disney princess stereotype by doing what she's told without second thought or standing up for herself. Yeah, that's a great role model for little girls, isn't it? But if she were to make a comeback, why not have her do heritage runs on the Vicarstown Tramway? It would have been nice if it had been expanded upon, if Mattel allowed it. I mean, they were going to introduce free tramway engines for the line in an early draft of the Great Race, but the plotline was dropped and they were replaced by the classic Arlesdale trio from Surto's Legend of a Lost Treasure. In the long run, we did end up getting small revvy engines adapted for CGI, and the trio have a wonderful chemistry together, but I'm getting off topic here. The last of the newbies for Series 12 was Colin the Wharfside Crane, and holy hell was he so boring and bland. We know literally nothing about him as a character, only that he's lonely. The only way he could have possibly returned is if the wharf were to be reintroduced in CGI, but with Ulfstead Castle, the Blue Mountain Quarry, and Croven's Gate already there, what would be the point of having both standard and narrow gauge meet up in another location? Now, Colin was going to reappear in an original version of King of the Railway to be animated by Guru Studios, but when Arc Productions took over, he was dropped altogether. Probably not a huge loss in the long run, I suppose. Series 12 was the second series to deviate from the standard 26-episode run by having 20 episodes instead. I personally believe in quality over quantity, but did having less episodes improve the quality of the writing? Nope. Henry Gets It Wrong is just stupid and illogical. Gordon Takes a Shortcut is riddled with plot holes and contrivances. The less said about Don't Go Back, the better. And Push Me Pull You is so painfully awful that it was such a relief the Scarlet Engines did not appear in the Nitrogen era, save for 2 episodes and 1 special in 2012. Though it is a shame that despite appearing sporadically since Series 17, with the exception of a 19th for some reason, they didn't get many episodes dedicated to them, but I'd much rather they get few starring roles and be well written than up to 8 episodes per series and be written poorly. As I mentioned previously, Series 12 was the first to have Sharon Miller as head writer, and boy does it show. But trust me when I say it gets worse from there. Series 12 was the last to be filmed at Shepperton Studios, Thomas's home since 1985, and it was the last to have involvement from Simon Spencer as producer and showrunner, Ed Welch as songwriter, and Steve Asquith as director, the latter of whom had been part of the show since the beginning along with David Eves and Terry Permain. That is real dedication right there, but perhaps not as dedicated as Carol Spinney playing Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch since the start of Sesame Street in 1969, all the way up to 2018, with the show's 50th anniversary celebration special being one of his final appearances prior to his death the following year. Rest peacefully, you utter legend. That being said, since leaving Thomas, Steve Asquith has applied for a job as a letter sorter, and I think he's pretty content with his position. When it comes to the CGI elements, the animation was directed by Dino Afanasiou, while Greg Tiernan, who later became full-time director for the next 4 series, worked as unit director with his wife Nicole Stinn as unit producer. Nitrogen Studios began production on Series 12 in November 2007, with it costing £2.5 million to produce, £1,000 per hour, taking about 5 days to film each episode. So roughly speaking, if we consider a 9-to-5 job, it would have taken about $40,000 per episode, which is roughly $800,000 to film the episodes, and the remaining $1.7 million goes into model making and CGI elements. Overall, it would have been about £125,000 per episode on average, give or take. Strangely, Series 12 has never aired on Japanese television, most likely because kids would have been confused by the model CGI hybrid, which I can understand. Despite that, some episodes have been shown exclusively at Thomas Land's 3D Theater and Video on Demand there. Among the other countries it hasn't been shown in include Hungary, Norway, Romania, Poland, and the Netherlands. A fair number of series and specials haven't aired across the various countries, but I don't usually mention that since it has no impact on the production or quality of each. Overall, it's safe to say that Series 12 has aged horribly, at least in terms of CGI animation. The writing quality at the time didn't help either. We had several episodes in the past few series that utilized the Three Strikes formula that Sharon Miller was infamously known for, but Series 12 was a lot more blatant about it, and no matter how many characters were brought back just for this series, it couldn't shake off the fact that it was a sign of things to come. I think it's safe to say that the likes of Duck and Oliver have since shown up in episodes of far greater quality, and I'd say that's for the best. Alright, so that does it for the hit model era of the show. Why people still call it the new series despite that they're not really that new anymore, I'm not sure. We better find a more suitable name for this era. But anyway, it was quite obviously a step down from the classic era. It started off decently with Series 8, and then Series 9 was just okay. But it was the 10th where things started to go downhill, even though the 11th was a step up, but not really by a whole lot, and Series 12 was where it bottomed out. But as I said before, this is not the worst the show gets. Here's my top 10 episodes of Series 8 through 12. Number 10, It's Good to Be Gordon. Number 9, Gordon Takes Charge. Number 8, James Goes Too Far. Number 7, Hector the Horrid. Number 6, Thomas Tries His Best. Number 5, Dream On. Number 4, Halloween. Number 3, Gordon and the Engineer. Number 2, Best Friends. And number 1, Emily's New Route. And as for the worst of that era, unlike the last one, I don't think there will be too many controversial choices, so here we go. Number 10, it's a two-way tie between Reneus and the Dinosaur and Skarloey the Brave. Number 9, Thomas and the Big Bang. Number 8, Henry Gets It Wrong. Number 7, Thomas and the New Engine. Number 6, Don't Go Back. Number 5, Topped Off Thomas. Number 4, Thomas's Frosty Friend. Number 3, Push Me Pull You. Number 2, Don't Be Silly Billy. And number 1 is probably the least surprising entry on this list, Edward Strikes Out. Well, that was painful, but we're only just getting started, folks. This is gonna take a while. Until then, I'm Zack, you're watching SODORAMA, and I'll see you next time, if I survive.